in 1498, in the courts of France, something extraordinary began to happen. Men were brought to trial, accused of a crime that defied all logic, turning into wolves and devouring children. The judges, educated men and versed in Roman law, faced an impossible dilemma: how to judge someone for becoming a beast. The documents exist. They are stored in the archives of Besançon, in the libraries of Nantes, in the ecclesiastical records that survived the flames of the Revolution. Pages and pages of detailed confessions, testimonies of terrified peasants, death sentences pronounced with the solemnity reserved for the most heinous crimes. But there is something that no historian could explain satisfactorily. Why did so many accused confess spontaneously? Why did they describe their transformations with such vivid details that the scribes trembled when recording their words? In the winter of that year, in the mountains of Francoc, where snow covers everything for 6 months in a row, 2 men walked along the road that connected Poligny to Saint. His boots sank into the fresh snow. The sun began to dive behind the toothed peaks of the mountains, painting the sky a red that resembled blood spilled on ice. Pierre, Bourgot the taller of the two, carried a knotty staff. He was known in the region as Pedro the Great for his imposing stature. Michel, Verdung, his companion, had small and restless eyes that constantly swept the surrounding forest. Both were shepherds, or they had been before that night of 1421, when everything changed. No one in the nearby villages suspected. How could they? Pierre and Michel were ordinary men. They worked, prayed, greeted the neighbors, but there were nights when they disappeared. And on those nights, children disappeared. 19 years earlier, on a New Year's Eve, Pierre Bourgot had lost his flock during a violent storm. The winds howled like feathered souls. The snow fell so densely that you couldn't see your own hand extended in front of your face. His sheep dispersed, swallowed by the white and furious darkness. Pierre searched desperately. His family depended on those sheep. Without them, they would face hunger. He shouted their names in the storm, but only the wind responded with his mocking howl. It was then that 3 knights emerged from the snow. They rode black horses like the night without stars. Their capes fluttered in the wind, but, and Pierre noticed this with a chill, the snow did not accumulate on them. She slid, as if something invisible repelled her. The last knight approached. His face was hidden in the shadows of the hood, but his eyes shone with a light that was not a reflection. It was something internal, like embers covered with ashes. "Where are you going in such a hurry?" The voice was soft, almost kind. "You seem distressed." Pierre, between sobs, told about his lost sheep, about his family that would go hungry, about the despair that consumed him. "Don't worry," said the knight, and there was something hypnotic in his voice. "My master will take care of your flock. It will protect your sheep from wolves. It will provide what you need. Just trust him." "Who is your master?" The knight smiled. In the darkness, his teeth seemed to shine with their own light. "We will meet again in 4 or 5 days. Then you'll know." The 3 knights disappeared in the storm as suddenly as they had arisen, and Pierre, staggering through the snow, found all his sheep gathered in a protected valley, as if invisible hands had led them there. 4 days later, the knight returned. "This time I was alone, and I didn't ride any horses. It was simply there, on the edge of the forest, as if it had sprouted from the shadows between the trees. 'My master wishes for your loyalty,' he said. 'In return, your sheep will always be protected. You will never know hunger again.'" Wolves will never touch your flock again. What should I do? Just this: renunciation of God, renunciation of the Virgin, renunciation of the saints of paradise. Kiss my left hand as a sign of vassalage." Pierre Bourgot hesitated. His whole life was created in faith. I knew the stories of hell, of condemned souls, of eternal fire. But he looked at his calloused hands, thought of his hungry family, of the sheep that were his only wealth. He reached out. The knight's hand was cold. Not cold as ice, cold as death, as if no blood had ever circulated under that pale skin. And when Pierre's lips touched that lifeless flesh, he felt something break inside him, as if an invisible rope that connected him to the sky had been cut. "Very well," murmured the knight. "My name is Michel. My master will be satisfied." For 2 years, Pierre lived without worries. His herds prospered. No wolf attacked them. It was as if the wild animals avoided their pastures. He began to avoid the church, arriving only after the holy water had been sprinkled, leaving before the final prayers. But something grew inside him. A restlessness, a hunger that wasn't for food. It was Michel Verdung who brought him back. Michel, who also had his own secrets, his own night meetings in the forest. Michel, who knew Moisette and knew others like him. "There's more to learn," Michel said on a moonless night. "Much more." They walked to Charnon Castle, where the forest was so dense that even at noon the light barely penetrated between the canopy of the ancient trees. There was a clearing there, hidden, where no one ever went. And in that clearing, Pierre saw things that court records describe only as abominations against God and nature. There were others there, men and women from nearby villages, people Pierre knew by sight. Each one held a candle, but the flames were blue, cold, emanating a light that did not warm, only revealed. And they danced, not like dancing at harvest parties, with joy and abandonment. They danced with strange, twisted movements, as if their bodies obeyed a song that only they could hear. Michel took Pierre to the center of the clearing. "Do you want the real power?" he asked. "Do you want to move with the speed of the wind? Do you want to know strength that no man has?" Pierre, hypnotized by what he saw, nodded. Michel produced a small bottle. Inside there was a dark, viscous substance which seemed to move of its own free will, an ointment prepared with ingredients that the court records did not dare to name completely, only referring to them as fat of dead children and devil's herbs. "Undress," Michel ordered, "and anoint your whole body with this pièce abed." And the moment the substance touched his skin, everything changed. A violent convulsion went through his body. Her bones seemed to melt and reform. Her skin tingled as if 1,000 needles pierced her simultaneously. He fell on all fours on the forest floor, and his hands— no, they were no longer hands— sank into the wet earth. He looked down and saw paws covered with gray fur. His nose caught smells that he had never noticed before. I could distinguish every animal in the forest, every bird in the nest. Each and then came hunger. It wasn't common hunger. It was an abysmal emptiness, a need that transcended the physical. It was as if all his guts had turned into a hollow cave that nothing could feel except meat, live meat, hot meat with blood still pulsating. Michel, also transformed now, ran to his side. Together they crossed the forest with impossible speed. The trees were blurred, the wind whipped their muzzles, and the moon, the full and white moon, seemed to illuminate a path just for them. They arrived at a village. Pierre didn't recognize which one. It didn't matter. There was a child playing alone near the fields, a boy of maybe 6 or 7 years old, collecting colored stones next to a stream. What happened next, Pierre would describe years later to the court with tears running down his face. But the tears only came later. Achi, that moment, that night, in that way, there was only hunting. The boy screamed. He shouted for his mother, for God, for anyone who could save him. But the village was too far away, and the screams didn't last long. When it dawned, Pierre found himself naked, trembling, covered with blood that was not his, vomiting on the side of the road. Michel was by his side, equally transfigured back to human form, equally horrified by what they had done, but not horrified enough to stop. For months, the transformations continued. Pierre never needed to undress completely again. It was enough to apply the ointment, and the change occurred, even on his clothes. Michel said it was because now Pierre truly belonged to the master. The beast inside him had awakened. They attacked on moonless nights when darkness was deeper. They preferred children, easier to dominate, less able to fight. A 4-year-old girl picking vines in a vegetable garden, a shepherd boy who had moved too far away from his flock, twins playing near an abandoned mill. Sometimes they just killed. Other times, and here, the court records become almost as if the scribe was reluctant to record the words, "their times they ate." Michel said that children's meat was the most delicious. Pierre, in his testimony, would describe the flavor with a mixture of horror and terrible longing, like an alcoholic describing his favorite drink. But there was a cost. After each transformation, when the ointment lost its effect and they recovered their human forms, they were exhausted. Not only tired, completely exhausted, as if every fiber of their being had been stretched beyond its limits. They remained prostrate days, unable to move, feverish, delusional. And in the delusions, they saw the children, your accusing faces, your outstretched little hands. His screams echoing eternally in some dark corridor of memory. It was one of those nights of fever that Pierre began to murmur. His wife, terrified, heard fragments, words about wolves, about blood, about things that couldn't be true. She tried to convince herself that it was just delirium caused by fever, but in 1440, when the accusations began to circulate, when entire villages demanded justice for their missing children, she knew the truth, and the time of werewolves in France was coming to an end. But before the end, the courts would need to answer an impossible question: how to judge men who sincerely believed they had turned into beasts. The answer would come, and it would be written with fire and blood. But this answer would reveal something even more disturbing: that perhaps the transformation was not only real in the minds of the accused. Maybe there was something else, something the judges didn't want to admit, something that history would prefer to forget. On September 18th, 1440, the Inquisitor-General for the Diocese of Besançon, a man named Boin, received a delegation of peasants. There were 37 people, men and women, with faces dug by hunger and suffering. Many brought with them small pieces of clothing: a children's shirt, a leather shoe, a hood embroidered by maternal hands. Each piece told a story of disappearance, from children who went out to get wood and never came back, of babies stolen from cribs during the night, of small shepherds whose herds were found intact, but their owners had evaporated like fog in the sun. Inquisitor Boin was an experienced man. He had already judged heretics, witches, church thieves. "I knew all the tricks of the evil one," But when the peasants pronounced the names of Pierre Bourgot and Michel Verdung, something in their eyes changed. He knew those names. I knew those families. "Bring them," he ordered. His voice did not admit a reply. "Bring them chained, and may God have mercy on their souls, because I won't." The arrest was quick. Pierre and Michel offered no resistance. When the Duke's soldiers arrived at their homes at dusk, they found both men sitting by the fire as if they were waiting. Pierre was praying the rosary. Michel stared at the flames. "It was about time," Pierre murmured when the chains were closed on his wrists. "The weight has become unbearable." In the dungeon of the buffet tower, separated from each other, the two men waited for the trial. They didn't sleep. They didn't eat. They just remained sitting in the humid darkness, each alone with their memories. And then, on the morning of the first interrogation, Pierre did something that stunned the guards. He asked to confess. Immediately. Completely. No torture, no threats, no need for coercion. "I want to tell you everything," he said to the scribe Jean Thomas, whose hand trembled when he wet the pen in the ink. "Every detail, every child, each transformation. I want it to be recorded so that everyone knows what we did, what we have become." And so began one of the most disturbing confessions ever recorded in European judicial history. Pierre Bourgot spoke for 6 hours. His voice never faltered. His eyes remained fixed at some distant point, as if he were reading from an invisible manuscript written in his own soul. Described the first meeting with Moise, the feeling of the cold hand, the exact moment he renounced God. And at that moment, he said, "I felt as if something inside me was dying, not my body. Something deeper, as if my soul had been torn out and replaced by a black void." He described the nightly meetings in the forest. "There were always 13 people present," he said, 12 worshippers and the master. Although no one ever saw the master's face clearly, he remained in the deepest shadows, and his voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. "We danced," Pierre continued, and the scribe noticed that his hands began to tremble. "But it wasn't us dancing. It was as if our bodies were puppets and invisible ropes moved us. And the song, oh God, the song." "What song?" Inquisitor Boin asked, leaning forward. "I don't know how to describe it. It wasn't made with instruments. It was as if the trees themselves moaned, as if the earth breathed in rhythm, as if the wind knew the words of a song that no man should know." Then Pierre described the ointment. The first time Michel had brought it, contained in a small clay pot, sealed with black wax. Michel said it was prepared by Moisset himself. He said it contained fat from newborns who had died unbaptized, mixed with wingwood ashes, bat blood, and herbs that grew only in cemeteries during the new moon. "And when you applied this ointment," the Inquisitor made the sign of the cross. "What happened?" Pierre closed his eyes, and for the first time his voice trembled. "I've turned." Pierre's description of the transformation was so detailed, so visceral, that the scribe Jean Thomas had to pause several times to control his own nausea. He described the sensation of the bones reconfiguring, of the skin being pierced by hair that sprouted from inside, of the jaws lengthening, of the teeth sharpening. "The pain was excruciating," Pierre said, "as if every part of me was being disassembled and reassembled. But it only lasted a moment, and then came another feeling, power, strength that no man should possess. I could run faster than horses. I could see in complete darkness. I could sniff the blood from miles away." "What about your mind?" asked the Inquisitor. "Human permanence, Pierre opened his eyes. An Inquisitor Boin, a man who had faced all kinds of evil, retreated involuntarily before what he saw in that look. "That's the worst part," Pierre, he whispered. My mind remained. I knew who it was. I knew what I was doing. It wasn't an animal acting on instinct. It was me, Pierre Bourgot, baptized Christian, husband and father, choosing to tear a child with my fangs, choosing to drink your blood, choosing to taste your meat. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the guards outside the door stopped it breathing. "How many?" The Inquisitor's voice was little more than a thread. "I'm not sure. Michel would say there were more. I clearly remember 15. But there are nights that are just fragments in my memory. Nights of pure hunger and hunting, where time ceased to exist and there was only the smell of prey and the taste of enough." The Inquisitor raised his hand, but Pierre didn't stop. The words gushed out of him now like pus from an infected wound, as if they had been under pressure for years and finally found an escape. He told about the 9-year-old girl who had strangled while she prayed, about the 6-year-old twins who had torn in half, about the baby she had pulled out of her crib while her mother slept in the next room, exhausted from breastfeeding. He told about the flavor, sweet and salty at the same time, more delicate than lamb, richer than pork. And he described the worst of all, pleasure. Not only the satisfaction of hunger, but pure and simple pleasure. The joy of hunting, the ecstasy of killing, the completeness he felt with the hot blood running down his throat. When they finally brought Michel Verdung for interrogation, they expected him to deny it. Let him fight. That accused Pierre of lying. Instead, he confirmed every word. And he added more. "Pierre is very kind in his numbers," said Michel, with an emotionless voice, as if reciting a shopping list. "It wasn't 15. There were at least 40, maybe more. He forgets the ones we hunted together in the lands beyond St. Claude. Forget the little orphans that no one complained about. Forget it. Why?" The Inquisitor exploded. "In the name of Christ crucified." "Why?" Michel looked him straight in the eyes and smiled. It was a terrible smile, empty of any humanity. "Because it was good." This simple pronouncement, recorded in the court's records in Latin, Chiavana Marat, caused more horror than all previous graphic descriptions. There was no remorse there. There was no humanity. It was the statement of a pure predator, without disguises, without excuses. But then, unexpectedly, Michel started crying. Not tears of regret, the scribe noticed, but tears of frustration. "They don't understand," he sobbed. "It wasn't me. Or rather, it was me, but it wasn't either. When the ointment touched my skin, when the transformation began, it was as if two minds inhabited a body. My human mind screamed to stop, to have mercy. But the wolf's mind just wanted to hunt. And the wolf's mind always won." "But you said it was good," pointed out the Inquisitor. "It was good for the wolf, and the wolf was me. And I was the wolf." How to separate the water from the wine after they have been mixed? This philosophical and theological question would leave scholars perplexed for centuries. Where did the man end and the monster begin? If the mind remained human, but the desires became bestial, who was really guilty? The man, the wolf, the demon who had provided the ointment? Physical evidence began to emerge. Investigators were sent to the places that Pierre and Michel had described, and there, in the exact places mentioned, they found bones, Small human bones, gnawed, broken, scattered as if by animals. In a forest near Paligny, they discovered the remains of at least 6 children, buried superficially under leaves and branches. The bones showed tooth marks, not normal human teeth, the experts observed, but also not exactly wolf teeth, something intermediate, something impossible. At Pierre's house, hidden under the floor, they found a small clay pot. It still contained residues of a dark and oily substance. When the Inquisitor ordered it to be analyzed, the city's apothecary refused after a single smell. "It's an abomination," he said. "There are things in this mix that no Christian should recognize." Witnesses began to appear. An old woman who had sworn to have seen, on a full moon night, 2 large creatures running on 2 legs through the hills. A woodcutter who had found strange footprints in the snow. They started as wolf footprints, but gradually, over 100 meters, they turned into footprints of bare human feet. And there were the families, mother after mother, father after father. They presented themselves to the court with their stories of loss. Some recognized specific descriptions that Pierre had given of his victims. A woman fainted when Pierre described exactly the little blue dress her daughter wore the day she disappeared, a detail that had never been made public. The weight of the evidence was overwhelming. Not only evidence of murder, but evidence of something deeper, more disturbing. Evidence that men, somehow, had really transformed. Maybe not physically, theologians debated this point fervently, but certainly spiritually. Certainly in our souls. And if this was possible, if men could really become wolves, then what other transformations were possible? What other horrors lurked in the shadows of medieval Europe? The sentence came in October. Both men would be burned alive. But before the fire, before the smoke and ashes, Pierre Bourgot made one last request. "I wanted to talk to the families of the victims." It was denied to him. Some truths, the Inquisitor decided, were too heavy to be heard. Some confessions should die with the confessed. And then, on a cold autumn morning, the bonfires were lit. Pierre and Michel burned together. Their voices united in a last howl that, the witnesses said, did not sound completely human. It sounded like something between man and beast, between sinner and devil, between this world and something much, much worse. But the terror was just beginning. Because in 1573, in another part of France, another man would be tried, and his confessions would make Pierre and Michel look almost innocent in comparison. His name was Gilles, and he was known as the Hermitage of Saint. In the next chapter of Lost Legends, we will dive into Gilles Giret's, the royal Bluebeard, where the boundaries between nobility and monstrosity dissolve completely. A marshal of France, war hero alongside Joan of Arc, turns out to be the most prolific killer of the Middle Ages. Get ready to find out how absolute power and absolute depravity merged into a single man. Because sometimes the real monster wears golden armor and eats at the king's table.